The answer to the question. That's the answer to the question. There's a guy in Harvard, he's a big law professor. So he's a very, very smart guy. He's involved in some very important legal cases. Anyway, he says the Rebbe has no power, none. He can't force anybody to do something. He has no army, he has nothing. He just has himself. And people listen to him. And they make great sacrifice in their personal lives. And then there's one other thing. The magic of Lubavitch, the reason Lubavitch is so special, because the Rebbe created a system, after Gimel Tammuz, Coca-Cola called up a shliach in Atlanta to say, what's the secret to Lubavitch? The secret to Lubavitch is that every single chassid has a personal relationship with the CEO, a personal relationship. You have a personal relationship with the Rebbe. You're not a shliach because you work for this guy, or works for this guy, works for this guy. You can't duplicate that. The whole magic of Lubavitch is the franchise model. Every shliach works for himself and the Rebbe, direct. And the minute you mix other people in, you have trouble. Anyway, Rabbi Yossi, the topic is Lag Baomer. Okay, I have a relative of mine who is harassing me. We did Tashlich by the Rebbe, Purim by the Rebbe, Pesach by the Rebbe, not Lag Baomer by the Rebbe. Now the problem is I don't know what to say. I don't know what happened Lag Baomer by the Rebbe. So I'm going to share the little bit that I know, and the little bit that I saw, and the little bit that I heard, and then the lot that I'm going to make up. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. Okay, so now you're in my second group. I did it yesterday. And I went through some of the history of Lag Baomer. Lag Baomer, of course, has two reasons. One has to do that Rabbi Akiva's Talmidim stopped passing away, and the other B'Shem did pass away. There's a great irony in that. There's a Yom Tov for two reasons. A, death stopped. B, a death happened. It's really ironic. But Lag Baomer is an interesting Yom Tov. Everybody celebrates Lag Baomer, even people who are very far away from Frum, certainly far away from Pnimiyas HaTorah, certainly far away from Zoyar, and certainly far from Shem B'Yachai. Because there is an undeniable fact that the biggest tzaddikim, the holiest people, who we have nothing in common with, we all relate to. It's so interesting. I told the girls, what's the proof that a Rebbe is a great Rebbe? And the answer, this is historic truth in Chassidus, is that they have shkutzim. That means bums who are chassidim. A chassid is a religious thing, A chassid is supposed to daven, a chassid is supposed to learn. How do you have a chassid who doesn't do anything except if you touch my Rebbe, I'll chop your head off? But that's the fact. The biggest tzaddikim not only had chassidim who learned and daven, they had the shkutzim. It was a sign of success that you had around you. The B'Shem B'Yachai, the holiest of holies, has tons of shkutzim. Everybody celebrates Hilula de Rashbi. Because everybody feels connected to this person, even if in their personal lives there's a lot of things need to be different. The B'Shem B'Yachai, Fakat, because he's so holy, has a resonating effect on all Jews. And I mentioned yesterday again to the girls, and I'm repeating this to you now, that it says even in the Maimorim, that amongst the Rebbes, amongst Tzaddikim or Rebbes, Nesiya Yisrael, the Rebbe gives an example from Rabbi Gamliel, I think, and Rabbi Chaim ben Doisa. There were great, great Rebbes who were very, very holy, and they led their generation. But there's a special class of Rebbes that not only they were great and they led the generation, they protected their generation. Their personal tzidkis was so great that they were poshet mogen al b'nei doiram. In other words, in Rebbes there's two levels. In the Nesiya Yisrael, in the Nasi, who hakoil, there were some Nesiim who were very, very great, and they led. Some Nesiim, they're great as in Poshet Gehid, their physical presence in this world protected b'nei Dedim. That's what the Gemara says about Rab Shimon. Kedayu Rab Shimon lismech Allah b'shas atchak. Rab Shimon is the kind of person when things are really, really bad, you can lean on him. And the Rashi says in Chumash that in the generation of Rab Shimon B'Yachai there was not a single rainbow. Not because the rainbow shouldn't have been there, because Rab Shimon B'Yachai was Megan al b'nei Doirai. And in the Rebbes, this is a special madrega, tzaddikim who are so great that their physical presence in this world protects all Yidden. And the koyach of Rab Shimon, especially in Lag Baomer, he passed away 1800 years ago. He's still mugging up Neideinu. He's still a real presence in our lives. Anyway, so yesterday I went through some of the history of Lag Baomer. I talked about the earlier Rabbeim a little bit. And the last thing I started talking about was miracles. By the Rebbe, by our Rebbe, this is where I'm holding. The miracles of Lag Baomer were staggering, were not normal. B'chlal, the Rebbe did miracles in every breath. Unbelievable, the Rebbe's miracles. And it always looked so like no big deal, It never looked like anything. But here's a story which is quite famous, and I heard it firsthand. The person who told the story says it in a video, and I watched him tell the story. that there's a young guy, he's a shliach in Massachusetts. His name is Alti Bukit, Rabbi Alti Bukit. He's a shliach in Lexington, Massachusetts. So this is one of his stories. That he's by the Ohel, Fartag, early in the morning, like 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock in the morning, and in walks a Satmar Chassid. A Chassidish Yid, not all Lubavitcher, it's clear Satmar Chassid, with two twins, with a set of twins, with Payas. They go over to the Tzion, and the father says to the two boys, the Mame. And at 5 o'clock in the morning, two Satmar boys, Chazid Isa, and he's watching this. Anyway, they spent a lot of time by the Ohel, they did what they had to do, and then they left. He's looking at this, he's very curious. They came in the middle of the night, which means they didn't want to get caught. But there's something strange about it, he looks familiar to him. The man looks semi-familiar to him. And then when they walk out, he walks over to him, and he says to him, what are you doing here? And so he tells him a story, that he didn't have children. So he knew that Lag Baomer is a special day by the Rebbe, so he came. Now, you have to understand, the Rebbe used to leave his house in the morning, there were 100 people waiting by his house. The Rebbe got out of the car to walk up the steps, there were another 100 people waiting. But the Rebbe didn't have time, he walked. So you had to sort of chaparate, you had 2 seconds to say your piece as the Rebbe is walking, and sometimes the Rebbe would actually answer you. The Rebbe went out from 7 to go to his car, to go to the mikveh, right there 100 people. He got out of his car to go to the front steps of the mikveh on Union Street, right there 100 people. He finished with the mikveh, came down the steps, right there 100 people. Came back the steps, another 100 people. Then 100 people when he went out to his car a second time to go to the Ohel. And then when he came back for the Ohel, people mobbed him. B'chlal, people mobbed him. But like Baomer, the people needed Oisis and Mevsim. And you would push to get to Imamish 2 seconds with the Rebbe. This guy shows up, and there's 150 people, 200 people. But he's a sakman, he's a chitzpahnik, and he knows how you behave around the Rebbe. You can't behave nice, because you'll never get any place. He pushes and he pushes and he pushes, and he doesn't get over to the Rebbe. The Rebbe gets into the car. He breaks through the barrier, there's Bochanim holding people back. He dashes over to the car, and as the Rebbe's closing his door, he pokes his head in. He says, Rebbe, ben Zucher. Rebbe, I need a son. So the Rebbe says to him, he's sitting in the car, in Yiddish, who's he going to play with? That was the answer. Who's he going to play with? So he stands there, like, what kind of question is that? I need a kid, who's he going to play with? So the Rebbe says, oh, Amen. So he says, Amen, you had twins, who's he going to play with? So when these kids turned 13, he said to them, Kindalach, we're Satmer, but we're going to Lubavitch, and you're going to Chazad the Maimed. Chas v'shon that Chazad the Maimed. Mestamet today to Chazad the Maimed, Williamsburg. The story, they were, Tafshin Dalad Mem is the story. So they were born 4 or 5 years after Gimel Tammuz. Today, Chazad the Maimed in Williamsburg, I don't think it's so terrible. Then, it would have been really bad. But he took him to the Ohel, Chazad the Maimed. And he says to Alti Bukit, says, I recognize you. You were one of those guys who was not letting me over to the Rebbe. That's how he recognized him. This is a Lag Baomer story, but the stories were not normal. Nisim in the place, mamish, miracles. People would stand and wait, and some people waited year after year after year, and you go to the Rebbe Lag Baomer. The Rebbe never forgot anything, never forgot anybody. It's not normal how the Rebbe knew us all. And in 2 seconds, you talked and you knew that it was not a new conversation, it was whatever letters you'd written, and the Rebbe was so on. And yet 5 seconds or 4, whatever it was, and the Rebbe responded to you in such a way that he knew all about you. He knew all the letters that you'd written, and understood what the situation was. And he answered each person however he answered people. But there were Lag Baomer, there were Nisim Gloyim, by the Rebbe, Nisim Gloyim. Mamish was not normal by the Rebbe, Lag Baomer. Anyway, so I wanted to just share that story. Here's a story, Lag Baomer Maaseh, but I'm going to tell it to you with a personal Hakdama. You'll never hear this from anybody else, because this is a personal story that I heard from my grandfather. He didn't tell it only to me, but I'm thinking I'm the only one who's going to repeat the story, unless he wrote it in his book. Lag Baomer Tafshin Yud was 3 months after the Frierdiker passed away. In those days, the Rebbe didn't even have a car. Bechlal didn't have a car until much later. The Rebbe got his car after Yudel Krinsky got married. The Rebbe used to take a car from the rental every time he went to the Ohel. Shmuel Isaac Popek had a rental, he would give the Rebbe a car. So the Rebbe went on a bus, a school bus. Somebody told me that there's a video taken by a goy from across the street of the Rebbe getting out of the school bus and walking into the cemetery. So they're holding on to it for I don't know what rainy day, but America's has, Gem has a video of the Rebbe getting off a school bus. The Rebbe would sit in the front seat, and Chadakov sat next to him, and everybody went on the bus. That was how they went to the Ohel. Bechlal, for many years, when the Rebbe went to the Ohel, a whole bunch of people with it. The Rebbe went in a full car. Unfortunately, you don't remember this, but when the Rebbe sat in the car, he sat in the back. A king sits in the back seat. When the Rebbe went home, if the Rebbe went any place, he sat in the back seat. But when he went to the Ohel, he sat in the front. There was a reason why. Because maybe for 10 years, every time went to the Ohel, a whole bunch of people went along. There was a regular group. Reb Shmuel went, Chadakov went, Reb Meshach Leib Rothstein went, and Leib Groner went. Now, the reason Leib Groner went is because remember, the Rebbe is standing by the Ohel, and there was nothing there. When I was growing up, the Rebbe had a room, a booth, which after the Rebbe's stroke, by the way, burned to the ground. It was mamash a godly thing. The booth that the Rebbe used to stand in by the Ohel burned to the ground. It was a wooden booth with a little roof over it, and when the Rebbe would come to take the roof off, inside that booth there was heating and air conditioning for the summer and for the winter, and it was very comfortable for the Rebbe. The Rebbe had a place to put on his bag, a shelf, and he would work. And there's video of the Rebbe putting the papers through the plastic or through the window. But that booth was not put in maybe for 15 years. So for all those years, the Rebbe came to the Ohel in the coldest, rainiest winter days, in the hottest summer days, and just stood holding his bag and reading papers. It was impossible. It was so hard. Label would push it, stand near the Rebbe and hold the bag. Hold it. Help him, physically help him do what he had to do. And at some point, the Rebbe told the Rebbe, Label, stay in 770, you have work to do. I'm assuming it's when they built the room, but for many years, the Rebbe stood by the tzin, holding his minor lashon and his bags and his work, with no place to put anything down.
Was there like walls around it like we have now?
Yeah.
Oh, so
the mausoleum was there. But the fence, there's a fence around the Frierdiker Rebbe's Ohel and the Rebbe's Ohel. It was much smaller. So in other words, when you went into the Ohel, there was a huge space in the beginning. Then there was the Frierdiker Rebbe's Ohel with a wall around it. The Rebbe wanted 10 tefachim high because of Kayanim. And there was a smaller space on the other side than it is now. Now it's symmetrical, it's square. And I have a mind-blowing story, now that you asked me. A mind-blowing story. A Yid in Shultman itself, he hates mince. That he was by the Ohel once in Tashlich. The Ohel had not yet been built. There was just a spot. And the Rebbe turns to Kazanovsky and he says to Kazanovsky, show me the plans for the Ohel. Show me the plans for the Ohel, the architecture, the plans of the architecture of the Ohel. So he shows the Rebbe the plans. Now you have to understand, if you could visualize the cemetery, the Frierdiker Rebbe's spot is in the middle of the plot. But the mausoleum is very far to the left. If you could visualize what's called Chelik Rishon of the Ohel, the first places where men are buried, the Frierdiker Rebbe's spot is in the center. But the Ohel is much larger. They had planned to make a smaller Ohel. And the Rebbe says to Kazanovsky, this is the whole size of the Ohel. He says, yeah. He says, but the Rebbe says these words, from wann weiß the Rebbe is da, after is the Rebbe da. How do you know the Frierdiker Rebbe is here? And it means witness this. How do you know the Rebbe is here? Maybe the Rebbe is here. So Kazanovsky said, but because we buried him here. And the Rebbe said, after hat sich harugetan. Maybe he moved. And the Rebbe was really, really upset. And he made a bigger Ohel. And that bigger Ohel is his spot. Now that I told you the story, I'll tell you again. The Rebbe is standing by the Ohel, in front of the Frierdiker Rebbe, and he turns to Kazanovsky and says, you have the plans, the blueprints for the Ohel. Remember, they set up the Frierdiker Rebbe's spot to be in the center. It makes sense. Everybody around. The way it is, the Ohel is it's very, very far to the left because they made the mausoleum much larger than they originally planned to make it. Why? It says Adria, it just made it out, and I'm repeating it to you. The Rebbe called Kazanovsky over and said, let me see showed him the plans. He says, this is the whole size of the Ohel. He says, yeah. I don't understand, but from one way, how do you know the Rebbe's here? Maybe the Rebbe's here. And he points to his spot. So Kazanovsky says, Vatem Daga Laked. We put him in. And the Rebbe says, maybe he moved. Anyway, so he's supposed to answer such a question. Maybe he moved. They made it bigger. And that's the Rebbe's spot. That's a maise. Anyway, the story I wanted to tell you was, Lag Baomer, people went to the Ohel. The Rebbe very much pushed people. Lag Baomer Tafshin Yud, the first year, 3 months after the Frierdiker, the Rebbe pushed very much, and people should go to the Ohel Lag Baomer. The Frierdiker Rebbe said that the Ohel of Frierdiker Lag Baomer is like being in Miran. There's no halamas vested. There's no blockage. And people should go to the Ohel Lag Baomer. And apparently they went with a bus or with however they went, but the Rebbe traveled with everybody. So my Zaidi Shusterman told me You know what? Maybe it wasn't Lag Baomer, but it was sometime. Maybe it wasn't Lag Baomer. But the Shusman told me that the Rebbe went with the Rebbetzin, Chaim Bushka, together as a couple, and the minor lashon had not yet been printed, so no one knew the minor lashon. So the Rebbe says two things. He says, "Either it's zogen the Tilim and Ichal zogen the Mzeir." How to say Tilim? You know which kapitel Tilim to say. But the Rebbe said, "I'll say the Mzeir because I know my heart." Basically, I'll say the Mzeir. But it's zogen the Tilim and Ichal zogen the Mzeir. And the other thing the Rebbe said was, the minor lashon is mostly kapitel Tilim and has a big piece of Zoyar. They didn't have the book, so the Rebbe says, "You'll say the Tilim because the Tilim you can take from a regular Tilim, and I'll say the Zoyar, which I'll say it by heart." And then the Rebbe said, Frierdiker, this is very interesting. You go over yourselves, and when you finish Velamir Tzugen, when you go away, then we'll go. So the people went over to the Tzion, and I'm sure they did a quick job. And when they finished, the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin together went over to the Frierdiker Rebbe. Now, it could be it wasn't Lag Baomer. Maybe I made that detail up, but it's a story that happened. My grandfather told it to me in the Erste Zeit. That they went together with everybody. And the Rebbe said, "Ihr zogen dem Tilim und ich zogen dem Zayar." And the Rebbe said, "Frierdiker Tzugen, you do your business, and when you're finished, then we'll go over Velamir Tzugen." Anyway, the Rebbe wanted people to go to the Ohel as a couple. They waited in the car. There was no inn.
Everyone left.
They went away. They didn't leave. They traveled back together. They walked away from the spot. They didn't leave. They walked away, and then the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin walked over. There's a lot of pictures of the Rebbe by the Ohel. The Ohel is not yet built. It took forever to build that Ohel. More than a year. Yud Shvat, Tafshin Yud Aleph, there's still not a full Ohel. You can see there's parts of it up, parts of it that are not up. But there's a picture of the Rebbe started by Frierdiker Rebbe where there's pushed a mound of earth. There isn't even a matzeva yet. Now, so anyway, the Rebbe pushed everybody to go to the Ohel, like Baomer, Tafshin Yud. So one of the interesting stories which is associated with that day is, it was 3 months after the Frierdiker passed away. And every time people would ask the Rebbe about being a Rebbe, the Rebbe would say, the Frierdiker Rebbe never told me. So the Chassidim had enough of it. So 10 Chassidim went to the Tzion on Lag Baomer, Tafshin Yud. And they told the Frierdiker Rebbe that the Rebbe keeps on saying that the Frierdiker Rebbe never told him. Maybe the Rebbe will tell the Rebbe, the Frierdiker will tell the Rebbe that the job is his. Anyway, the Rebbe went to the Ohel. He came out of the Ohel. He went away from the Tzion. It didn't happen right away, but he never used that excuse again. The excuse as a Chavnish Kenero, he never used again. He got whatever happened, but he never used that excuse again. Now, I want to give you a background to set up the parades, which is what I want to talk about. Obviously, like Rebbe by the Rebbe is predominantly the parades. So I'm starting from the beginning, okay? In 1929 and 1930, the Frierdiker Rebbe visited America. He spent about 10 months here. The Frierdiker Rebbe was in every major Jewish community all the way till the Mississippi. He was in St. Louis, the Frierdiker Rebbe. He traveled all over by train. It was a very, very difficult trip. You can see the pictures when he came. He looks unbelievable. And when he left, you see that the man is absolutely exhausted. The Frierdiker Rebbe, you could see. He was in every big city where there was Jews. He was in Chicago, he was in New York, but he was in Boston, and he was in Springfield, and he was in Milwaukee. You name a city where there were Jews, the Rebbe was there. Sometimes he would pass through and stop in the train station for a little bit. Sometimes he'd come in and spend the day. Verschieden has done it, but the Frierdiker Rebbe also checked out America. There's a video of him walking off the ship, looking around, looking. The first time he came, he said, "Rebbe, he's taken in the territory because we're not supposed to look where we walk. The Rebbe is supposed to take in everything. He's looking and looking and looking." So the Frierdiker Rebbe had a tradition going back to the time he was 11, that he wrote every day in his journal. Every day wrote in his diary. So the way it's understood is the Rebbe had a tagbuch, that means a little like a calendar basically, and he would write very briefly, short notes each day what happened that day. But in addition to that, he also had a longer version of the Yuman, much of which has been lost unfortunately, and a lot of it was in the form of letters. He used to write long letters in Yiddish to the Rebbe's Necham Medina during the whole time he was in America. This mamish, a day-by-day account. These letters have been found and they were published. They were printed in the Beis Mashiach. I don't know why they didn't print them in Igros Kodesh. But he wrote letters to the Rebbe Tzacham Medina, hour by hour, what was going on his trip. And the Beis Mashiach printed it and translated it into Hebrew. But for some reason it was not included in Igros Kodesh. But it's many letters. And of course he tells his wife, when I come home, give me the letters. This was upon him his longer Yuman. He was sending him his letters to the Rebbe Tzacham Medina, to his Rebbe's. In one of those letters, the Rebbe is writing about America. And there are two quotes that I'm going to share with you from those letters. Quote number one, Das ist a Medina, was jede Sach beweist man. It's a country where everybody is showing off. Wherever the people, everything is an advertisement, everything is showing off. Stell sich vor, was für ein niedrige Menschen sie sind. Think about how low they are. Everything the Hobart has to see, everything Hobart has to know. Think how low are people, Frierdiker writes his wife. Think about how low these people are. Everything is a show. Everything the whole world has to see. But the other quote is that the Rebbe writes to his wife, to his Rebbetzin, about the situation in America, American Jews. Bechlal, the Frierdiker Rebbe was much more positive about American Jews. All the Gedali Yisrael felt that in America you can't be a Yid, and the Frierdiker Rebbe said American Jews are very sincere. They're a good dough, you can make from them the best bread. The Frierdiker Rebbe loved American Jews, the Tmimus, the sincerity. And when he came the second time, he said, I was right, you see I was right. They were all wrong and I was right. But he writes to his wife, Unser Mendel mit sein Wissenschaft wird sie, whatever word, überzeugen, he says, our Mendel, meaning the Rebbe, with his scientific knowledge, with his secular knowledge, will get them, will take the American community. There are people who say that after the Rebbe visited America, his relationship with our Rebbe changed because he understood why the Rebbe felt that he needs to get this so-called higher education, because he saw what's going on. But these are two quotes of the first visit of the Frierdiker Rebbe when he came to America as a prelude to what I want to share with you about the parades. The Frierdiker Rebbe came to America, Tessa de Sheni Tafshin, 1940, in March. A sick old man who couldn't walk and couldn't talk. But as I heard one man who was a witness to his arrival, he came off the ship, this time in a wheelchair, shooting on all cylinders. The Frierdiker Rebbe was on fire. Wow, he was working. Every minute he was working, busy. He had no people, he had no money, he had no connections, he knew nothing. But he was changing America. He was so passionate about not wasting 1 second from the moment he got here. You know, Chadakov once said over that when on the ship, the Frierdiker Rebbe called him over and says, I'm planning to come to America and put all my efforts into chinuch. Give me suggestions about chinuch. And Rebbe Chadakov says, I told the Rebbe 3 things on the ship. Chadakov had spent his whole life in chinuch. He was the what do they call it, the administrator, there's a better word, for all the Jewish schools in Latvia for many years. He was a big expert in chinuch, superintendent, yeah. So the Rebbe called him on the ship. He traveled with Frierdiker Rebbe on the same ship and said, I need suggestions about chinuch, and he gave the Frierdiker Rebbe 3 suggestions. And he said over the 10 years of the Frierdiker Rebbe being in America, one after another, the Frierdiker Rebbe implemented the suggestion that Chadakov told him on this ship yet. So he came to America, the Frierdiker Rebbe then he started to work. And there were a couple of things that he knew must happen. First of all, kosher Jewish publishing. There was no Jewish literature for children at all. One of the biggest initiatives of America in the beginning was Jewish books. I mean, we're now long in the business of Jewish books. You know, there's a lot of others, but in those days there was no such thing. If you were a frum boy and girl, you could not get, if you were a teenager, admonition. Even as a child, there was no, the conservative and the reform had, but kosher Jewish literature did not exist in America. And one of the first things the Frierdiker Rebbe started was the talks and tales in Yiddish and in Hebrew and in English to provide pashut kosher Jewish literature for American children. And he wanted to reach all the kids in the public schools. And he was trying to figure out how, the Frierdiker Rebbe. So the very, very first project that he started was Mesiba Shabbos. They would send boys and girls to all the shuls, and they would invite a lot of the public school kids to come Shabbos, there's no school, to come to Mesiba Shabbos. In those days, they were very careful. They should make all 5 brachas. A mezenes, and a hagefen, and a shahakal, and a adoma, and a ha'etz. They would dafka give them, which make all the brachas, because it was instructional. And they used to give every counselor who did the Mesiba Shabbos guides on what they should share with the children with the Mesiba Shabbos. A little while after, somebody came to the Frierdiker Rebbe with the idea what's called release time. No, but someone knew that in the public school there's permission to take the children out for religious instruction once a week on Wednesdays, and the Frierdiker Rebbe jumped on it. And this became the Kirov tool in the very beginning. It was called Mitvach Shah. You go back to the 1940s, there were thousands of Jewish boys and girls in public schools in Brooklyn. You didn't have to go any place. Brooklyn was infested with Jews, not from Jews. Every public schools, some public schools were so full of Jews that their Shani and Kippur, they would push it close. No one came to school. Full of Yidden. These Yidden grew up in homes, you're talking now 80 years ago. These children spoke Yiddish. But they were American. They were not frum, unfortunately. And they would gather these kids on Wednesday, take them out of the public schools, and take them to a nearby shul, and they do it now. Release time program has not ended, but now there's a Chabad in every city. Release time program saved thousands of kids. There are many, many people today who are frum because of the mitzvah Shah. And it was one of the first projects that the Rebbe started. A year and 2 or 3 months later, our Rebbe came. It was called the Ramash, the Rebbe. When the Rebbe arrived, it took a little bit of time, a couple of months, and the Frierdiker put him to work. Then he put him to work. He stole his life from him. And he gave him all of these activities. The Rashag, his other son-in-law, was in charge of the yeshiva. But all the new creative projects for Yiddishkeit in America, he gave our Rebbe. The Rebbe has been running the Americas for 80 years, more than 80 years. Americas and Yonah Chinuch and Kahos and Machon Yisrael were given to our Rebbe. It was his business. And the Rebbe began to develop all these projects. Well, Machon, just to give a simple example, the Rebbe was the one who put the comics into the Talks and Tales. The Rebbe said, he told a guy who used to draw the comics, Ich will es so sein als wie Dick Tracy. How did the Rebbe know Dick Tracy? You don't even know who Dick Tracy is. Dick Tracy was, in the old days, he just read newspapers. Who reads newspapers today? There's a whole page of comic strips. And the favorite comic strip was a detective named Dick Tracy. And the Rebbe says, Mach azevi Dick Tracy. The Rebbe looked in the newspapers. He saw what the kids thought was cool. And he told the artist, whose name I can't remember, I want it to look as cool. I want the kids to look at it. Make it modern. Make it cool. And every single Talks and Tales, until the Rebbe became Rebbe, and then these things stopped, had a page of comics, pictures. And the Rebbe wanted to be the kinds of pictures that American children would enjoy looking at in Yiddish and in English. And the Rebbe got involved in everything. And they did a lot of things. One of the brainchildren of our Rebbe, I think it's our Rebbe's idea, going back to the very beginning, as soon as he got here, was the parade. The first parade was not on Lag Baomer, it was some Sunday. They gathered kids from public school, and they marched on Eastern Parkway. There's pictures with placards that keep the Shabbos holy, give your children a Jewish education. It was all very primitive. It's all you're talking 80 years ago. 80 years ago in America, children were marching. And the idea was very simple. Since in America everybody shows everything off, we're going to show off Yiddishkeit. It's very simple. If every whack job makes a parade and announces to the whole world, this is how I'm whacked, and this is how you're whacked, and this is how the other person's whacked, we're going to be whacked with Yiddishkeit, you understand? Now you must understand, the biggest problem we faced was from the Reform community, Reform Jews, because Reform Judaism is predicated on the idea that Jews have to hide. You're not allowed to show off. Why? Because if you show off, you create anti-Semitism. That was the whole German model. The whole Reform movement was be a Jew at home and a mensch, that means a good German, in the street. So the Reform fought against us tooth and nail. Now they're imitating us, whatever's left of them. But this was a big, it bothered them. And they fought against Lubavitch. Any place Lubavitch came, one of the things they hated more than anything else was the public lighting of the B'nai and the parades, because that was Jews showing off. And the Rebbe said, not in America. You want people to hate you less? Show off, don't hide, show off. And parades became a very important part of the work of Lubavitch. And it made Jewish kids feel proud. You go to a parade, okay, let's say for example, they have the Chabad weekend with the teens, and they go to Midtown Manhattan, whatever it is, 42nd Street, and they have a concert, and they make Havdalah. It doesn't look very holy. And it's a little bit, for me, it doesn't, I don't get excited by it. But you need to understand those kids. Those kids are one of the most important spots in the world, and they know it. They know it a lot better than you do. When they visit New York as tourists, they go to that spot. And they're celebrating being Jewish. I tell you that Matzah Shabbos Havdalah in 42nd Street, the Times Square, what they do, is the reason that many boys and girls will marry Jewish. That's enough. They're never going to forget that. You, as a Lubavitcher, it seems weird, that it doesn't seem Hasidish, doesn't seem appropriate, it seems very wild. You need to understand that kids, if you know where these kids are coming from, they will never forget for the rest of their life that concert on a cold, freezing Saturday night in Times Square. And it's all about being a Jew. They should remember that they're Jewish and it means something. This to the Rebbe was so important. As Lubavitcher kids growing up, as a kid, I couldn't understand it. When you look at it as an adult, you start the Rebbe's vision. The Rebbe doesn't need the parade for you. The Rebbe needs the parade for these kids, and for these kids, it is beyond your wild imaginings how much it means to them. I danced in Times Square as a Jew. That means being Jewish is so cool that you can own Times Square for a few hours. It belongs to you. They're never going to forget it. It's so deep in their neshama. And the Rebbe was very, very into this showing off that you're Jewish. And showing off that you're Jewish was the parade. So I'm going to share with you two stories. One story I heard from a friend of mine. I've told it to you many times. I wish I could remember from whom. Because it's so much more true. If I can tell you my source, if I remembered my source, I'd be much more comfortable. So I heard it as a bachar. I heard the story more than 30 years ago. In other words, I heard it when it happened. Two bachrim in Montreal were on a miftzayim. And there was an office building that had very important lawyers and other kinds of big machers. They snuck into the building. How to get into a building, you do all kinds of tricks how you get into the building. And they went from office to office bothering Jews. They eventually got themselves kicked out of the building. But before they got kicked out of the building, they had the following experience. They come to a man's office. The man's about 60 years old. He's an attorney. He's a lawyer. Very powerful man. And he sees them. He says, "You're Chabad?" He says, "Yeah." He says, "Listen, I'm not putting on tefillin. And you're never coming back to this office again. I don't want to see you. But I need to tell you something." And he tells them the following story. And girls, try to visualize this in 3D as a real story, because it's realer than real. It's realer than real. I grew up in Montreal in the 1930s. If you grew up in the Montreal 1930s, you didn't want your neighbor to know that you're a Jew. Not that you practice it, that you're a Jew. If you wore a yarmulke, you wore a hat. If you wore tzitzis, you tucked them into your pants. You hid your identity as a Jew because you were ashamed of it, and you were literally afraid of anti-Semitism. That's how I was raised. That's what my parents taught me. Then the boys came from Poland, the nine Lubavitcher Bacharim, and they opened up a yeshiva in Montreal. They came in Tafshin Beis at the end of 41. And they did the same thing. Mesiba Shabbos, release time, parades. I was a kid. And my parents sent me to these parades, whatever it was. Whether it was the Shabbos, Mesiba Shabbos, or was the release time. He says, I marched in those parades as a child. And for the first time in my life, not only I didn't hide I was a Jew, I was happy to be Jewish. He says, the Lubavitcher Rebbe made the Jewish people proud. Now get out of my office. That's exactly how the story was told to me. The Lubavitcher Rebbe made the Jewish people proud. Now get out of my office. Understand, making the Jewish people proud is already a good thing. But that pride automatically includes a mi-ani, a self-identity. The Rebbe told somebody, the guy's going to make a kosher kitchen. He says, we're going to have speech. He says, no. If a kosher kitchen and a Jewish boy sits next to a Jewish girl and they start to talk, maybe they get married, that's enough. I don't need drushes. The Rebbe is on the grassroots. The Rebbe is concerned with the first level, what everybody forgot. The Jews that we think are lost, that's the Rebbe's target. And he speaks their language. He understands them better than we do. He's more modern, he's more cool, and as you like say, he's more with it than we are. He gets it. And the whole model of Kiruv that the Rebbe started, that's been developed over these 80 years, is to speak their language. And in America, it's a parade, it's a demonstration, show off. So the Rebbe started parades in the very beginning. Now the second story. Again, this is a story, it's not about the parade, but it's the same message. The Rebbe came to America after Shavuos, Tafshin Aleph, right? And let's say in June, the end of maybe in June 1941. 4 months later was Tashlich. I told you the story Tishrei time. So the Rebbe asks, is there a place to do Tashlich? Because it's the middle of a city. So it's the middle of a city, there's no river, there's no lake. If you can't do Tashlich, Rosh Hashanah, you go during a Seder Simei. That's the tradition. So he told the Rebbe, 1 mile from here is Botanical Gardens. Botanical Garden has a lake with fish. It's a man-made lake, but has fish. And all the Frum Yidden, in those days, Crown Heights had a lot of Jews, go there for Tashlich. The park stays open past 5 o'clock. The Botanical Garden closes 5 o'clock. Rosh Hashanah, they stayed open till 6 or 7 to let all the Frum Yidden come in. And of course, they didn't ask you for a paper. You would walk in and do your thing and leave. Anyway, so 6 o'clock, 5 o'clock, on Rosh Hashanah in 1941 to 42, Tafshin Beis, about 80 men gathered in front of 770 to go to Tashlich, which is 1 mile from 770. on our side of Eastern Parkway. It's after the museum, before the library. Okay, if you know Crown Heights, it's after the museum and before the library. So they're starting to march, and the Rebbe stops and he says, "Nitazeh Gateman." That's not how you walk. The Rebbe was still 39 years old when the story happened. He wasn't yet 40, but he was the Ramash. And the Rebbe had such countenance. The Rebbe walked into a room, you stopped. The Rebbe didn't have to say a word. The Rebbe's power, his presence was wow. People say, before the Rebbe was Rebbe, when you were in his presence, you felt this was no simple guy. But again, Tzveit say, line up in formation, walk pairs. He stops and he thinks, und sagen an Nigen, and singing a song. So Zalman Posner was 14. And he was American. He says, I was never so humiliated in my life. But they did it. No one said boo. Who's the Ramash telling him what to do? Who asked him? So they lined up in pairs of 2. That means 40 pairs. They started marching to the market, singing. As I'm 14 years old, and in my head I'm imagining every single person in the entire Eastern Parkway is looking at me. Remember how Crown Heights was so Jewish. And everybody was in temple. Reform, conservative, it's not like today. Every Jew went to shul. They were so much closer to the Frumas ages. It's 80 years ago. You know, today you have people who are not Frum for 4 or 5 generations. Then it was 1 or 2 generations. The Zayda was Frum. Sometimes the father was Frum. So everybody was in shul. So nobody worked. So Eastern Parkway fills up with people. Every window, all those big apartment buildings that you see past our neighborhood, every window open, people come on the sidewalk. Thousands of people watched this procession. And it continued, girls, for 25 years. Well into the Rebbe's Nasias, this continued. And the whole Eastern Parkway would come out to watch the Rebbe march. Anyway, they went to Eastern Parkway. They did their thing. And Chas v'Shalom, they should go back the same way, because then he would only be embarrassed by 5,000 people. They went back with Union Street. The Rebbe never went back the same way he came. So another 5,000 people had to see him. So Zalman Posner tells the story. I said, I learned the power of prayer. Because I prayed to God that next year I should somehow be spared this indignation, and the Eibishter heard his prayer. Reb Shmuel Levittin was then almost 70 years old. He was an elderly man. He could walk fast. And he also didn't daven fast. The Rebbe davened very fast and walked very fast. So Shmuel says to Zalman Posner, would you mind walking more slowly with me, because I can't keep up with the procession? Would I mind? I'm delighted. I don't want to do that. Anyway, so he walked with Reb Shmuel. By the time he got to Tashlich, they were leaving already. So he finished with Reb Shmuel, and they walked back, also on Union Street. It's the 2 of them. All the people who come out of their homes to see this whole tzir, the whole spectacle, were still outside. And a man in his 50s looks up to Zalman, and he grabs him by the collar. Why are they singing? Why are they singing? And Zalman thinks, so I went from the pan into the fire, you know. I don't want to participate, they got to explain it. So he says, I started to, what am I going to tell the guy? Because there's a sugar named Ramash who says we got to sing and we have to listen to him. What's the reason? So he starts to stammer, he doesn't know what to say. So this man says, I'll tell you why they're singing. Every Jew has a little spark inside here. This man tells him. And sometimes this spark gets verschlafen, becomes latent. And when they walked by, this is the middle of the Holocaust, singing, I'm proud to be a Jew. I'm proud to be a Jew. And that's not what they were singing. But that's what he heard. That spark ignited and burst into flames, and he walks away. So this is a meisel, and a parade, as the Rebbe calls it. And the third story, you also know probably. The third story is Yoshel Goldstein. He told the story, but the Ichigon Ere told the meisel, that in the early parades, the Seder was, the kids would march in Eastern Parkway. But before they marched, they would come to 770. Now remember, 770 used to be a house. And on both sides of the house there was empty space. On the king's side of the house there was a driveway that went down. It was a very wide driveway down till the basement level. And you had a room to turn a car around. There was a 6-car garage behind 770. It's a big garage. And on the left you had the same deck, towards the Union, the same deck which is there now. On the right side of the building was also a porch that ran the length of the house. 770 was a beautiful building before we messed it up. It was gorgeous. There was a porch that ran the whole length of the house. So the kids would gather in the backyard. They'd put up chairs. It was a big, big backyard where the driveway was. The Rebbe would stand on the porch and talk to the children. Our Rebbe. When the Rebbe talked to the children, even before he was Rebbe, he didn't suck up to them. He spoke just like you see the videos. He spoke like a Rebbe speaks. and he spoke in Yiddish, and the children didn't listen, but he kept on talking. It was always that way. Before the Rebbe was Rebbe, he talked like that. And Yankel Hach got up on a chair, and he translated what the Rebbe said. Of course, he continued doing this for many, many, many years. As the Rebbe comes onto the porch to talk to the children, and of course they were very careful. They gave the children all these different foods. They should make different brachas. They were very aware of the chinuch value. The window opens on the second floor, and the Frierdiker Rebbe is sitting in the window. And he listens to the whole drasha of the Rebbe. He watches the children, and then when the Rebbe finishes, the Frierdiker Rebbe leaves. When the children left, the Rebbe goes upstairs, and the Frierdiker Rebbe calls the Rebbe. The Rebbe runs upstairs to the Frierdiker Rebbe. As Rabbi Yossi Paltiel described, the Rebbe used to do 2 steps at once. The Rebbe didn't walk; he flew up the steps. He ran into the Rebbe the Shver, and he comes out. When he comes out, he calls over Itche Gronet, and there was a Yid named Osher Kazanovsky. They organized that parade. And he says to them, "Yekum jetzt for Shver, I'm coming from the Frierdiker Rebbe. And since you organized the parade, I want to tell you what the Rebbe just told me." And the Frierdiker Rebbe told the Rebbe, this is what the Rebbe repeats to them, that the Alter Rebbe wrote on the Siddur that on Shabbos you don't say V'Shomru. And during the week you don't say Baruch Hashem La'elam. After Hashkivenu, because it's a hefsek. The Baditchev Erav once said to the Alter Rebbe, he put it in the Siddur, but he wrote not to say it. You notice, right? V'Shomru is on the Siddur, we don't say it. Why is it there? Because the Alter Rebbe's friend, the Baditchev and others asked him, why don't we say it? Put it in the Siddur, he wrote not to say it. Because Lapi Nigla, it's a Shalfan HaHefsek. Lapi Alocha. So Baditchev Erav said to the Alter Rebbe, Mechitten, Amizuk V'Shomri V'Teganse Yirid L'Mayla. When you say V'Shom, there's a huge market in heaven. And the Rebbe said to Baditchev Erav, the Alter Rebbe, Nit of Yed Yirid Daf Megain. You don't have to go to every market. So the Frierdiker tells this to the Rebbe. So the Alter Rebbe told the Baditchev Erav, not every market you have to be. And then the Frierdiker Rebbe says, but of them Yirid is the Alter Rebbe Zicher Gewinn. But this market, how many kids do you think the whole thing was? 100 kids, 50 kids, didn't matter. The Alter Rebbe was here. He said, the Frierdiker tells the Rebbe was here. Okay, I'll see you when I see you.